So first, who you'll be hearing from this morning, I'm Katherine Riley. I am the INCITE Program Manager. I'm also the Director of Science for the Argonne Leadership Computing Facility. And then additionally, you will hear, actually when in the real meat of the presentation, you'll be hearing from Dyma Bykov from Oak Ridge and Yasaman Ghadar from Argonne. And these are both team members who are deeply involved in how we manage INCITE and how we go through the process. Next slide. So what are we going to do today? In really a short form is we're going to go through an overview of INCITE and actually in the very first few minutes talk about some of the things that are different this year versus other years. There's not a lot. That's the really short version. And then walk through the details of the proposal. So really what this webinar has been designed for is to make sure that you understand particular components of the program and the requirements, but then also how to write the proposal and what we are expecting to see within that proposal. Next slide. Moving into like key information to know early on in this presentation for INCITE, and I'll get into defining that in a few minutes, but new proposals this year are due June 16th. So these are for anyone without a current INCITE proposal or someone whose current INCITE proposal is ending in 2025. Renewals have always been due a little bit later. So renewals are due July 21st. If you are eligible for a renewal, you should have received an email from the INCITE program office. If you believe you should have been eligible for a renewal and you have not received that message, please reach out to me immediately so we can clarify your situation. Next slide. And so as I mentioned, the agenda really for what we're going to do today. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the program, of some key statistics for INCITE, right? So you sort of understand where you might fall. And then we're going to talk about very briefly the details of the systems that are in INCITE for 2026. And then, as I said, we're going to walk through the details of the proposal itself. We will have a Q&A. There is a space for questions at the end, but just to mention this again, since new people are joining, please, I invite you to use the chat for questions as we go through the presentation this morning. Sometimes those are the most on point and the most timely and can really help other people as well, rather than saving them all till the end. I like questions in the middle. Next slide. So the real quick few points for people who might be familiar with INCITE already and are just looking for what do I have to worry about this year? That's different. There's a few things that are different, but nothing major. Substantially, it is the same program asking the same questions as it has been for the past few years. One thing that is different is that Polaris is staying in. Last year, we had announced that 2025 would be the last year for Polaris in the INCITE program. It was moving on to serve a different program, but that program isn't quite ready to fully utilize the system. So Polaris will stay in INCITE for 2026. We are, only 1-year proposals, please, for it, because as I said, it has a target for another program, but right now it will be available fully for 2026 INCITE awards. There's a few things that were newer last year. I'd like to mention them just so people are aware. I think the most really relevant one for people to think about is that we ask in the when you're writing the proposal, you'll see this on PeerNet, it is a short paragraph. It's a paragraph for potential public use, and it is a valuable one. If your project is given an award, it gives us a jump start on some description for what your project is doing. Next slide. 2 other new questions. These are not required questions when you're submitting the proposal, meaning that you might not have an answer, and that's fine. One of them is we're asking if your proposal has any particularly special requests or special requirements. And what that really translates to is if you've got something like a streaming requirement or near real time or on demand or something that is not as consistently offered at the leadership computing facilities, we're just asking you to identify that. If you end up having those requirements and you haven't identified it, that is okay, but this really helps us make sure that we have what we need in place if a project is awarded. It helps us call out the kind of requirements we're seeing in proposals as well. If you do not know, if you're not really quite sure if what you're asking falls into this, just drop me an email and we can clarify that. You can also ask the folks at the facility. If you're talking to anyone, they will know. The other one is we're asking, this is to help us and to help the facilities. We're asking a question about training opportunities, and it's really just simply are asking if you are aware of some of the different opportunities that the ALCF and OLCF know of. I'm sorry, offer to train, to learn how to use the systems, etc. And if you've attended any of those. And so this is really just a helping us question, but we are very hopeful that people will give us some information through this one. Next slide. So as I mentioned, again, Polaris is available through 2026, and the other primary resources are Frontier and Aurora. Aurora will have more time available than it did in 2020, the 2025 year, which is this year, as this was its very first year in availability. So next year, the amount of time will go up. But for the most part, it will look very similar to the 2025 year. Next slide. All right, moving into a little bit of background. So those first few slides were really based on this premise of, we've got some folks who've joined who know the program well. Here are some key things you might need to know, and that might be all you need to know for a quick update. But I do see some new folks have joined the call, so I'll just use this as a pause to sort of say, we're going to get into a little bit more of the meat of it now. And as I mentioned already, encourage questions in the chat while we're going through the presentation. So INCITE is the primary mechanism to gain access to the leadership computing facilities. It is 60% of the total allocable time on both Argonne and Oak Ridge systems. The other 30%, right? The other sections of the machine allocable time, 30% of that goes to our program sponsors in the Office of Science for the Oscar Leadership Computing Challenge. And while I'll mention a few things about INCITE, right, which has sort of no mission directive, right? It is really a national user facility program designed to serve open science. Oscar's ALCC program has a little bit more of a bent to serve DOE mission. The other 10% after 60/30, you're left with 10 is the director's discretionary. And hopefully everyone is familiar with the director's discretionary. I will give you links if you are not. But this is 10% of the time that is individually managed. So Argonne, manages its discretionary. Oak Ridge manages its discretionary. But this is meant to be time that is relatively quick to get access to. It is much smaller, but it allows you to do things like get ready for proposals, get on the system, test what you want to try to do, and demonstrate your case. It is also used for other things like strategic purposes and more exploratory projects. But in the spirit of today's call, really, this is the driver for preparing for an INCITE proposal. Next slide. And so what is INCITE? INCITE was started back in 2023. Has a little bit of a history, but we don't need to get into. But fundamentally, INCITE was created as the flagship program for the leadership computing facilities. It is the mechanism by which we deliver on our mission to deliver the largest scale compute for open science. This is rooted in, ideas of providing, many times more resources than you might be able to get access to at other compute facilities to do incredibly high impact work. The root of INCITE is that this is not a program where we try to spread all the resource of Oak Ridge and Argonne across, many projects. INCITE tends to award a small number of projects. And again, this is rooted in this premise that we're looking for projects that are not just impactful scientifically or in their field of research, but that also have a real need for these scale of resources. Next slide. And it's a really broad range of areas. I keep thinking about how to update this slide, and I've been messing around with it, but I'm not happy. The short version is that this slide gives you a sense of some of the areas of research that we have seen over the course of INCITE. It is a very broad range, and there's substantial amounts of growth in many different research areas. So, for example, biology has seen a huge growth in the course of the past 10 years to being one of our largest areas of research. Of course, biology is also a really big umbrella, just like, if I put physics as a big umbrella, it's of course a really huge umbrella. But it's a broad area, and I would be hard pressed to respond no if somebody said, could this area of research apply to use INCITE. I think really we have seen slices of almost everything as we go. So it's really state-of-the-art research across a broad range of research areas. Next slide. And related to that, right, is that there's no requirement, right? There's no metric where, for example, we have to provide a certain amount of INCITE time to support a particular mission need. It is really looking for just those areas of research that are the most exciting. So the criteria for whether you are able or should submit an INCITE award is primarily first on the merit. So we're looking for research campaigns with potential for significant domain or community impact. That is, of course, a broad definition. It's a very general statement. This can be impact because you're answering a problem that has been longstanding or that's very important for your domain. It could be that you're providing a resource, a data set, right, that your community really needs, or a tool that your community really needs. You can sort of keep growing from there. But one of the points, right, is to really demonstrate the impact that your community would see from these results. The second criteria is that you need to use these leadership computing facilities in order to do your work. Now, that could be because the scale of the work is very large and you need just straight up the scale of these resources, but it could be that your time to solution requires these, right? So there's a timeliness, and trying to solve your problem on other resources would take you 2 years, but here you can do it in a more reasonable time frame. It could be that there's special architectural needs, or you need to do AI at scale. Broad sense of things, right? But we can also walk through, if you're not sure if you fit into any of those criteria, we can help you both in the program office and at the facilities. I will just tell you now, I keep saying that at the program office for INCITE or at the facilities, we're all the same people, because the program office for INCITE is made up of folks from Oak Ridge and from Argonne. So it's the same folks, but you can reach out to either and we'll make sure you get an answer. The third criteria is your eligibility criteria, and this is what I like to joke is like the non-criteria. You may apply for INCITE and have a chance, a completely, non-biased chance of success, regardless of your funding source. So you do not need to have DOE money. You do not have to have US funding. INCITE is international. Next slide. And that's right. This is a 15-page application. This is just a question I see in the chat. And we will walk you through exactly what that looks like in a few slides. But that's right. The project narrative is 15 pages. And so this is where you would have, including, an abstract, right, an executive summary, but get into the details of your science, your campaign, your readiness, etc. We have a twofold review process for INCITE, and I think this is valuable for people to be aware of. The most important one by large fraction, I mean, this is like, the huge fraction, the most critical part of the review for an INCITE proposal is the scientific review. There is a second assessment of your proposal, which is our technical assessment. But the technical assessment, which is run and executed by the facility staff, is really looking at whether, okay, have you run on the systems that you're interested in, or at least run on something really similar? Is your code able to run? Is the kind of campaign you're trying to do capable of running at the facilities? It's really doing that sanity check so that we know that we would be able to support you if you were awarded, right? It's, as I describe it to many people, a risk assessment. And it's, it might be that, a lower technical assessment just means we might have to put more resources, and, for example, into helping support your project. But the most crucial component is this science review. And the primary ask of the science review is to make sure that the project is a good project, that there is merit both scientifically and technically to do this work, that the approach is appropriate, and that the right team is in place, right, to get that done, and that the request is consistent with the type of problem that you're trying to solve. This is a deep, long process, actually. This is really what takes us the bulk of the time from midsummer to September, when we actually hold science panels. And so the panels are where I work to group proposals, really sort of similar proposals are all managed, in one panel conversation. And while the reviewers come in with their reviews, there's also an additional conversation about the full panel and really about all of the proposals within that suite. And they help us provide input into those proposals that are most exciting. If you are a renewal, The science process and the technical assessment is slightly different. We do ask different questions in a renewal because the premise is that you've already gone through the scientific review. We don't need to redo the scientific review. What we're looking to make sure of is that you are staying on scope for the science that you originally proposed, and that the merit, given the fact that not everything goes completely perfectly right for everyone, that the merit is still there, right? And that you're on track to meet the future milestones. And with the technical assessment, it's very similar, right? Making sure that if there were technical problems or if there were computational milestones, understanding where you are with those and why you might be ahead or behind on them. But the route, I would say, is that if you have a question on a renewal, reach out to me. That's often the easiest one if you're concerned. But really just make sure if you are submitting a renewal that your work is staying on scope. And if you're thinking about introducing new aspects of the research, bring that up with me, the program manager, or you can bring that up again with someone at the facility if you're working with them, just to make sure that it doesn't send up a flag and that I can properly advocate for you. But the process, all of that, right? The scientific review and then the technical assessment feeds into the award committee. And the award committee is fundamentally made up of the directors of science from the facilities and the directors and the program manager along with senior staff. And you will hear from the INCITE program in early November about the results for INCITE. There are some limitations for INCITE, but there's very, very few. The primary limitations for what we can do within INCITE have to do with the security plans that we are required by federal law to have. And so really this is rooted in terms of, the level of sensitivity of data. So for example, PII or excuse me, like certain classified information cannot be on the system. There is the ability to have some sensitive, for example, medical data, but please reach out just to make sure that we are able to manage your data properly. Please, please, please reach out if you think there's any sensitivity about your data on the medical side. As I said, there are some capabilities that have grown, but there are still really key things we cannot have, for example, like that are on this list. Next slide. And then another common question about what can and cannot be done is whether we support proprietary work. So I see a question about de-identified EHRs, and this is just, it's earlier for me than I'm normally functioning. EHRs, health records, right. If they're de-identified health records, I don't want to confirm this without actually just triple checking because this can be so sensitive. But one, there are some folks from Oak Ridge who might be able to confirm this pretty quickly, but we will get back to you just to absolutely verify that it is all right. Just because there's so many categories I have learned really in the past like 2 years in the medical space. So it's not ignored, but I just don't want to give you an answer right now and have it be wrong. I'd rather make sure that it is on the approved list. So for proprietary data, so this really comes down to a project that's asking if they can apply for INCITE, but not be what amounts to what we call open science. So the intention is not to publish the results of their work in an open journal in some timely manner. So we can do that. We have done it at times. When we do that, that requires full cost recovery. And that requires some negotiation with the facilities that you are targeting your research on. So if you believe you have a project that absolutely has to be proprietary, I need you to reach out immediately to me as the program manager to start that conversation. And one of the other reasons to start that conversation really early is we often actually find that there are ways that research can continue, get the targeted result that is needed by the project, but actually still be able to execute an open science project, right? It's not playing games. We can just realize that there's ways if you did something similar with a different geometry or a different time frame for publication, we can come to an agreement on this. But we need to have that conversation quickly because those proprietary arrangements can take some time. Next slide. Then another common question is community versus umbrella proposals. But what that means is you have to understand what I mean by a community versus an umbrella proposal. So we've had both of these in the history of INCITE, but I will describe what I mean. So a community proposal is where you have a community. It might be a subdomain, a group of researchers that have come together because they've agreed on how they want to try to tackle a problem. And there's an approach that they have. And it might not be that everybody's doing the exact same thing, but there is some agreed upon strategy. And that's how we define a community proposal. An umbrella proposal would be described as really you have maybe 5 or 10 or whatever, some number of smaller research problems that are not really connected that are being put under an umbrella in order to meet the scale of resources that an INCITE proposal would need. So all of those individual problems could be done completely independently elsewhere on different resources, but you're just bundling them together to be a larger ask. Of course, you can write whatever proposal you would like to write, but we encourage community proposals and discourage umbrella proposals. And there's a very simple reason. For community proposals, as I mentioned, right, this is a community that has agreed upon a strategy for how to solve a problem, even if there's, some different components to it. And that allows a proposal that is discussing a problem and gets into depth about how that problem is really being tackled. So it gives our science review panel some meat, right, to dig into and really understand what you're trying to do and trying to accomplish. With umbrella proposals, right, when you're thinking about 5 or 10 or whatever, different numbers of problems, all independent of each other, that are put together. You've now taken this 15-page proposal, this 15-page narrative, and you've split it between 5 different problems, right? So there's only 3 pages or maybe even fewer per problem that is being tackled. And that's substantially less information. So it is far harder for the review panel to compare a proposal like that when there's no sort of cohesive larger strategy or driver to another proposal that is spending 15 pages driving in more detail to a specific problem. And a more concrete example of this is we've had scenarios where we've had, a proposal where it's really studying in-depth problem X, but then we've got another proposal that has problem X as one of a subpart of 5 or 10 problems. And the review committee just is left going, I can't review this umbrella proposal very effectively. I have the details of how they want to tackle the first one, right? That isn't an umbrella, and I'm left without any details on the second one. And so it really causes a difficulty in that review process. And that is why we discourage them. If you have questions about whether you fall into an umbrella category or more questions about what these might mean, reach out to me, please. Next slide. All right, some statistics to give you a sense of where things have been and where they might go. Last year, we closed the call around the same time. We close it around the same time every year, but June 14th last year. And we awarded 146 proposals. So 110 of those were new, 36 were renewals. Sorry, we did not award that. I am so sorry. That was what was submitted. I am so sorry. There was 146 proposals submitted. That was a good year for INCITE, right? That's relatively high. It does fluctuate from year to year. We awarded, I am so sorry, 81 projects. 45 of those were new and 36 were renewal. The counts were also relatively high. As you know, we had Aurora coming into first year, and we tend to be very generous in the first year or two of a system as we're trying to get people on and get people to scale up. 41% of non-renewals were accepted. So if you were submitting a new proposal, 41% acceptance rate. And of all of those 146 proposals, 92 proposals were meritorious. And so what does that mean? That means that 92% of the proposals were proposals that our panel said, if you can fund these. All of these, 92% of the proposals were ones that there was good reason to fund. So that gives you a sense of the competition. So it's not that like 146 proposals come in and most of them are bad. And so we find the good ones. Really, we tend to see very high quality proposals that come in through INCITE. For oversubscription, hold if you can hop back, Mark. For oversubscription, this is also a valuable one. It gives you a sense of the demand on certain resources, right? So Frontier and Aurora, they're huge resources. And so currently that oversubscription rate is really shared about 2.5 times oversubscribed. Polaris, though, is a smaller resource. And I think has been a very friendly resource for many people to use. It is incredibly oversubscribed. So I ask you to consider this in what you're asking for, to be aware of it, right? So last year was much harder to get time on Polaris than it was any other resource. And generally, we are split, right? There's a broad range of areas where our PIs are coming from. The bulk, by far, though, has always come from academia. And then from government here means coming from a research lab, like coming from a DOE lab or NASA or NIH or, some other, federally organized research area. We had about almost 5% last year of international PIs. That's consistent with history, kind of comes and goes and shrinks. 7.4% from industry, and then 2.5% nonprofit here. Really, for example, private research institutions like Flatiron, et cetera. Next slide. And some more details on the statistics. These will be available if you want to look. I think the key thing for people to take away from this slide is the average project sizes. So the average project size in Polaris is 130,000 node hours, native node hours for Polaris. For Frontier and Aurora, the average is, 650, 700,000 in term total, individual project size. But I will point out, right, on Aurora and Frontier, that's mostly because you see a broad range, right? We also have, a substantial number of projects that are targeting in that 1 to 2 million range. That is really, a suggested range, I would say, for you to consider when you're thinking about your need on Frontier and Aurora. Next slide. And I do want to touch on our early career program. So this was created several years ago as a place to give people in their first 10 years out of their PhD, a sense of a landing space within INCITE. And it really stemmed from, sometimes PIs opting not to apply because they realized perhaps their advisor and these other 5 big people in their field were applying, and they're like, why even try? And so we really wanted to encourage young PIs to try and compete. And so we commit up to 10% of the INCITE time every year to early career proposals. All that's required in the early career is that you just check off that you are early career you're within 10 years from your PhD, and give us a short paragraph. I will generally say that early career proposals tend to be incredibly well written. So I would encourage you to, realize that it's still actually very competitive, even within early career. But we see actually quite a few early career proposals come in. There is a chance it can help your award, right? So there's a component. Okay, well, maybe if we haven't hit 10% on the program, do we want to, dig deeper to sort of make sure we've got an early career proposal that we are awarding? But generally, I'll just give kudos to early career folks who are writing INCITE proposals. They do a fantastic job. So last year we awarded 13% time to early career. So we exceed it most of the time because of the sheer number of really good proposals we see. The variation in terms of these percentages is really just normally a function of, like, say, on Polaris, there's not a lot of statistics because there's so few projects, right? So it just kind of varies, in terms of hitting the total numbers. Next slide. So does early career only apply to academia? It does not. So if you are in 10 years from your PhD, you are still early career no matter where you went in your career trajectory. So you may absolutely apply even if you are in industry or in a startup. So oh, that's a great question. There's a question about hybrid classifications, like industry government partnerships. Yes, there are absolutely substantial numbers of those. I will be frank, right? I don't do anything super clever with that data analysis. I look at the primary affiliation of the PIs, and there is only one PI when you do this. So if I actually took a different slice of the INCITE and of the PI and co-PI institutions, there are a huge range, and I would say it's really it's kind of all combinations of academia, government, foreign industry, and all shuffled together. So there's quite a few that are hybrid. I mentioned the science panels, and we'll come back to the science panels a little bit in the future too, in a future slide. But I just want to give you a sense of who we're bringing in. So last year we had 103 scientists and researchers who came in and joined the panels. These are folks from across the range, right? So we've got, I would say, pretty prestigious folks, right, within this panel community, who are both in academia, who are in labs, who are in industry. We promote some degree of carryover from year to year, so there's some consistency, and so that there is really a bit of a memory within a panel. which we have found valuable, but we also do try to have some turnover every year. So every year we are trying to bring some new minds in, and I'm actually often looking for new young minds, right? So it's not just, it's like an old, if we don't just want, say, an old guard from a particular field working, we really want to see a broad range of perspectives within that science panel. And I will say that while this has been true, it might not be something we do next year, or sorry, for 2025, sorry, for the 2026 call in 25. So previously, right, if you had a proposal, it was a domain proposal, right? You were working in biology, but, in biophysics, for example, but you had a significant data component to your proposal or learning component, we might have you cross-read with another panel that has been focused really primarily on learning and data technologies. I think at this point, most of our science panels have a good coverage of expertise in how their domain is using data techniques and learning techniques. So we might not do that. It does kind of depend on how the proposals fall when we get there. And we do occasionally have proposals, though, that are read in two domains. So for example, if you have a proposal that is, really straddling biology or chemistry, we might have a panel that reads both of those. Can an early career PI have PIs who are not co-PIs who are not early career? Yes, yes, very, very commonly, right? So we definitely do see, an early career PI is submitting, but other names we, for example, might know are as the co-I, and that's fine, right? My desire, right, to see an early career PI is that you are driving this proposal, right? So you are writing it, you are managing it, right? So for good and bad, you're managing it. um, and just by the bad, I mean that there's homework, right, associated with managing a proposal, as I'm sure you know. So it is completely fine, and it is valuable, right, to have the insight of people who are not early career as co-Is. That is fine. But what we're really looking to make sure of is that this is your proposal, that you are not just writing it, but that you are executing it and driving it. So I just, a little bit, that's, our faith, right? We're extending that faith to the project team, but that's what we're looking for. Right, next slide. Okay, so a couple key points, and then I'm going to have some other people talk to you, and you can stop looking, or hearing my voice over and over again. As I already mentioned, the resources for the 2026 call are Frontier, Polaris, and Aurora. Frontier and Aurora, which are the primary resources for INCITE. So these are the exascale resources, and by far the most available amount of time is available on Frontier and Aurora, are available for 3-year proposals. So 1, 2, or 3 years. Polaris is going to only be available for 1 year. And again, this just goes back to it has a future, that is not in INCITE, but we just want to make sure we're using the resource well in the meantime. We are going to cover a little bit of these details. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. That's fine, Mark. We're going to cover those resources very lightly in terms of the details of them today, because there's substantial information on both sites for Oak Ridge and Argonne. I mean, you are welcome to ask detailed questions about the systems, but we're not going to spend as much time on the actual systems as we are going to talk about the proposals this year for this webinar. All right, and there's often a question about how do we estimate time. And I will leave these slides, this and the next slide, really primarily as reference. But so the question is, if you are not on Aurora or Frontier or Polaris for that matter, how would you estimate the time? And so this is just some guidance. The first bit of guidance, though, that I'm going to tell you is that get on one of these systems, right? So if you are targeting Aurora, if you are targeting Frontier, get on them. Ask for a discretionary now, and try to get some initial data. Try to get your code ported and get some initial data. That is by far the best way. However, if you have some information from other systems that are similar, there are scenarios where you can extrapolate that. So for example, for Frontier, if you have used an MI250X somewhere else, and you have also scaling information for your problem, you can submit that. It is not as strong as trying to do this on Frontier. And if you have been doing this long enough, you understand that one of the reasons is that it doesn't just translate, right? The systems are individual in many ways, right? And so there's subtleties to all of this. So getting on the system and doing something within the facility is one of the best ways to test it. Will this, ruin your proposal? No, it will not. But I'm just saying, from a lot of experience, that getting on and trying locally is really one of the best ways to really prepare. And you do have time if you do this right now, right, to probably be able to get access and get some initial data. So as I mentioned, right, there's some guidance here, like for example, on, as I mentioned for Frontier, on Aurora, right, if you are on Polaris and want to request Aurora, that actually is one that we understand very, very well, right? We understand the environment of Polaris, and we understand how that translates to Aurora pretty well. But this gives you some specific guidance for a path to follow. And I would also recommend that if you do find yourself in a scenario where you need to estimate the time, reach out to that specific facility that you're estimating time on and talk to them about that. You can go through me, and then I can connect you, or I can just specifically help you. So, and this goes to the second slide, right, which we're on, right, which is really the best practices are to get on, alternatives are available. Next slide. The other thing to remember is that we ask for the requests and time to be in the native hours for each resource, okay? So if you are asking for time on Aurora, those should not be like in NERSC SUs. Please don't. Please don't, because we have actually not even a very good, translation for that. It really needs to be in the node hours native to that particular system. And so there's, some basic guidance for Aurora, but most people should be able to get on Aurora at this point and estimate directly. But we do provide this guidance just because it is still early in its life. So you can do a 2-to-1 from Polaris to Aurora and a 1-to-1 factor from Frontier to Aurora. I just also need you to be very transparent if you are doing these estimates. So if you are doing a translation, right, be very clear, I ran on this system this way, and I'm doing a translation. And that just helps when we're doing our technical assessments to understand exactly where you're coming from. And as I mentioned, questions, bring them up, please. Next slide. So I'm actually going to hand this off. So we're going to bring in some of the other parts of the team that help me run INCITE. And we're going to start with Dyma, who's going to speak a little bit about Frontier.
Thanks, Katherine.
Thank you.
So very briefly, the resource which we're going to allocate at OLCF in Oak Ridge is Frontier, our flagship machine, and Frontier is going into the 3rd year of production runs. So it's established machine. It's an HP AMD Cray machine with the peak performance more than 1.5 exaflop. So the hardware, again, coming from AMD, we have an EPIC CPU, and we have an AMD Instinct MI250X GPUs. So the ratio of CPUs and GPU is 1:4, although every MI250 GPU device has 2 GCDs. So basically, you can see them as 8 GPU devices. So we have 512 gigabytes of RAM and 512 combined high bandwidth memory on the GPU side. The total node count is 9,408 nodes. The interconnect is also coming from AMD. It's a Dragonfly topology Infinite Fabric from AMD. So we have a large storage attached to the machine. Is the GPFS system was almost 700 petabytes. So to be brief, you can read more. The links are at the bottom of this site, and just a few words about the software stack. Again, it's HP machine and AMD, so the software coming from those companies. So Cray environment, Cray/HP environment. We have all the libraries and tools for development, performance testing. We have the common programming GPU models installed. We have AI/ML tools. So basically, most likely we'll be able to accommodate your development goals. But if you have something a little bit more exotic and you are not sure if we have that provided for you, just let us know. Follow the links, check, and just let us know. So we'll continue with the ALCF resources, and Yassi will talk about Aurora and Polaris.
Thanks, Dyma. So I'll be talking about the two resources that we have this year for INCITE from ALCF and also some key aspects of writing proposals. So as Katherine mentioned, we will have, again, Polaris this year. Polaris is a smaller scale machine with 560 nodes. It is NVIDIA A100 GPU with AMD CPUs with 44 petaflops of double precision. So when we basically made Polaris available, the idea was to make it as a stepping stone for Aurora. So you can test, run your applications from Polaris and then convert it to Aurora. Now, one thing I would like to mention here is Polaris is the machine that you can still use CUDA, but on Aurora, this is the only programming models you will not be able to use. So be aware of it. And if you are planning to go from Polaris with the CUDA code to Aurora, make sure that you use the converting tools available to convert it to the proper programming models. Next slide, please. Okay, Aurora became basically a production machine earlier this year. It's our exascale machine at Argonne. With over 10,624 nodes. It's Intel GPU and CPUs. And with a high bandwidth memory, it is again an HPE Cray machine with HPE Slingshot 11 and Dragonfly topology. So they are very similar to Frontier in that sense. One of the key or unique aspects of Aurora is actually its storage space, the DAOs, which is object storage, so it's different than the regular storage, and it allows for a higher performance for the applications that are IO bandwidth and so on. So make sure to take advantage of that. Now, if you have questions or you want to test the DAOs, please make sure to let the LCF support staff know so they can help you setting it up before applying for INCITE. Now, as I mentioned, this is an Intel machine, but we do have a lot of different programming models available for you to use and in different languages. But CUDA is the only one will not work as is, but there are tools available that you can use to convert that. And make sure to look in our website for more information. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next couple of slides is going to be sort of focusing on what are the things to think about ahead of time when you want to write a proposal and when we as the reviewers looking at your proposal. So these questions that are in this slide basically are the similar questions that a reviewer will ask. So you answering them will basically extend and increase the chances of your application to be successful. So the first one is saying is a scale of the runs and the time that demands is actually of the problem of ALCF. So you have to think about that. So we will talk about in some runs I see in the chat in a bit. So you think about you have a large simulations you cannot done, let's say in HPC clusters. So that would be a good example that you can run it on on the ALCF systems. Sometimes you need a unique like hardware available on the system. For example, DAOs or large memory or IO that you require for your system, and that's only available in LCF resources. So that's another way that you can say, yes, I need it. But let's say if you can run your application in the university HPC cluster and you can get the results in a meaningful time, then probably you don't need ALCF resources. And one thing that we do ask in the proposals and as the reviewers, we actually look at that information is the personnel justification. So we would like to make sure that you do have a correct and actually you do have someone to work with you on that project for duration of the INCITE. For example, if you're having a postdoc or graduate students who's mostly dedicated to work with the INCITE on the INCITE project, that would be great. Keep in mind that both ALCF and OLCF do provide staff to help you with your project and make sure kind of resolve your issues. But having someone on your team to work on it and that relationship can help to move and push the science project forward, that's really important. Not having that kind of delays the project. Next slide, please. Okay, so continuing with that question, now if you are, this first question only applies to the folks who are applying using large data and AI needs. And again, the question comes there like, do you actually need the ALCF resources, or can you just run on a couple of GPU nodes to run for your AI applications? And sometimes you have maybe a lot of small simulations, but that they are dependent to each other, or they have some specific relation to it that you can actually use workflow solutions. So at Argonne, we offer like wall sums, parcels, and other workflow solutions. And if your project requires these kind of workflows, then that could be a good reason to use LCF resources. Then we would like you as a PI who's writing it, thinking about the post-processing strategy. When you've done collecting all this information, how are you going to put them together? How you're going to analyze them? Are you going to keep them on the LCF? Are they going to be on disk? Are you going to move them to your own HPC clusters at the universities or other places? How is that plan? So knowing the plan really help us kind of understanding your project better and your needs better. Now, another question that I think it also came up in the chat was related to the this can hundreds of thousands per year as opposed to yes, that's, they said like, yes, so they said this can save hundreds of thousands per year as opposed to AWS just in storage alone. So INCITE, even though we are not, you can think about the INCITE allocation as millions of dollars. So it is money, but just because you're not paying for it, that doesn't mean it's not valuable. So it's very valuable resources, and you have to think about it that way. Now, if you have ensemble runs, which means a collection of runs, and not like one job, but there are lots of large or small jobs, but they are dependent on each other, or they have requiring of I/O scalings on Power 5 systems or so. So that could be another good examples. But let's say if I can run them independently on a cluster node and I still can't get the results that I'm looking for, then that probably not a really good project or good use of resources of ALCF. Now, do you understand the life cycle of your data? So for example, you're going to collect a lot of data, intermediate data and final data, and most likely a lot of research is done after you're collecting all of those data. You need to do some post-processing, some analysis to get the final numbers you're looking for. So how are you going to manage all of these? Are you going to like regularly move them to your personal space? Are you going to keep them on the LCF and OLCF resources for post-processing analysis? So make sure that you kind of think about them ahead of time. And if you require larger storage or larger disk space, make sure to request that in your project allocation. Next slide, please. Now, as a PI, you probably have heard this before, know your audience. Now, I'm going to mention it again. But why is that? INCITE is a very broad in scope. We have projects from climate change to cancer research, to dark matter and black holes, to batteries and so on. So there can be many different projects that get awarded in INCITE, which means the reviewers are going to be very savvy senior scientists or engineers, but very broad in the scope of their skill sets and knowledge. That means when you're writing your proposal, you have to think that they are not familiar with your specific field. And it's very important for you to make the case that why your specific field is important, why is it important to use the LCF resources, and how using these resources will actually impact the research and is going to provide the science you're looking for. So think about it that way, and don't think that, oh, they're going to be scientists, they will understand my research, so there's no problem. I can just say here, just dive into the details of it. So always that information that you provide to us as a reviewer makes it a huge difference to get you closer to being awarded as INCITE awardee. Next slide, please. I'm just going to take a quick pause here and say, are there any questions? Okay, as Katherine mentioned, just follow and you can ask questions in the chat as well. So we do provide a sort of the proposal format and the website. Make sure you just grab that format. And usually we start with the executive summary, which is 1 page. I want to emphasize on that. This is a kind of important page because it gives me sort of everything in 1 page, a scope of the project, what is the impact, how you're going to use the LCF resources to achieve your science goals. And it allows me to kind of set my mind to what I'm going to read in your proposal. Next slide, please. Now, the project narrative is basically the bulk of the proposal you're going to write. And I would say this is the very important part of your proposal, because the scientific challenges and the significance, this is up to you as a PI to tell me that why this is important and why it has to happen now and why you need to use the resources as ALCF or OLCF. The other thing is sometimes the research can be done in other resources. So us as a reviewers, think about that. And if we see that your application, for example, is a better fit for another allocation programs, then you're going to lose points for INCITE program. So make sure to signify the importance of your research to be done on ALCF and OLCF resources, and also the research and the science by itself. So those are 2 key aspects that you want to make sure to address them throughout your proposal. Next slide, please. So objective and milestones. I would say as a reviewer, this is one of my favorite tables, the milestone table. Especially from the PIs who took the time to explain that the key milestones, the key objectives of their project. So usually you have every couple of months, you have to reach certain points in your project. So you're sort of estimating that by this time I'm going to calculate A, and by this time I'm going to calculate B, and so on. And you explain these in details. But in the milestone table, you actually put all of these together, plus how much time and resources you need. So make sure you actually include the sort of the math behind those calculations, and don't just throw, hey, I will need like 10 million node hours on Aurora or 5 million node hours on Frontier to reach this milestone. That is not as helpful as you tell me I need to do these calculations. Each calculation takes about this time. So together it will take that much time. And this milestone table is a really good way for reviewers to assess the project and the needs. And in the case that we cannot award the total requested time from the PI, we can reduce it, but we can look at the main key aspects of your project and make sure you do get those times so you can still continue research. So pay very much attention to this milestone table. Next slide, please. Okay, so within the computational approach, which is actually the technical assessment of that comes to play, you want to, again, think about your reviewers as a scientist or PIs from different universities, other national labs, industries, and so on. So they have different perspective from their experiences. So they will understand things, but they're not familiar with your specific subfield. So make sure that you describe if you're using a code, just mentioning the name of the code, maybe not enough. But if you mention that the key math or algorithms that you're using to explicitly calculate those functions or values that you're doing to do for your research, that would help us to understand, okay, this is the part that this might be a bottleneck, this is the probability that they can use, and it gives us like perspective of your code. So explain those. So, and I don't mean like too much because you only have a 15-page total and I think 5 pages for the computational approach, but explain them in some details that this is the code or this is the main part of the code that will be maybe the bottleneck and this is how it's been used. If you're using a specific private version of a code, make sure to mention why you're using that. A lot of times we may not have the specific code that you want available on our site, but we can help you install it. So it is a very good idea to use the discretionary allocation to install and check and make sure your codes or the dependencies of the libraries, for example, are working properly on the system, or if you have to tune it, you've done that ahead of time. This will help us to understand that, yes, you have tested on the system, you are familiar with the bounds of the system, so you can work around it. And okay, next slide, please. So data management is also another segment of the proposal, which I believe you explicitly ask if you have a specific storage request and what is your plan for data management. Now, we are asking to understand that if you're creating, let's say you're running a very large jobs, which will create a very large output files or the IO, how are you going to take care of them? Are you just going to keep them on the system for the whole time of INCITE duration? Are you going to move them? Are you going to do some post-analysis with them? For example, you may want to do some visualizations, which requires you to input some large input files, and how you're going to manage them. Now, again, we do have resources at both facilities. We do have teams that they can help you. So do reach out ahead of time, work with them to have a plan in place, and telling reviewers that you have this plan and you have tested maybe on a smaller case, and you know the workflow is really helpful to maximize your INCITE award acceptance. And now if you are working with the data and AI and workflows, so again, we support a lot of different AI machine learning frameworks in our system. We have a couple of workflow solutions like Balsam and Parcel that I mentioned, or if you have your own workflow solutions, it would be great if you can test them ahead of time, or if you can test a similar one on a dissimilar machine and say, this is how it works, and I think it will be working on our machine. So these are the great way to show that you have thought about it, you have tested the maybe smaller cases, and you're confident that this will work in our systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is another, I would say, kind of my favorite maybe slide or favorite segment within the project, that when we are asking when the INCITE PIs provide the details about their runs, and when you can actually see the progress. So usually when you get access, you want to do some sort of functionality testing, some kind of fine tuning with your input files to make sure that you're using the best input files and setting up the best variables for your system. And when you do that, you're sort of having some milestones to reach, and for each milestones you will probably have to do different type of calculations. So showing us those type of informations and actually writing the math equations for us and say, okay, this is how I'm going to achieve here, and that's how many nodes I'm running, plus probably some padding on it. So that would be great for us as a reviewer, because we can look at them, we can add them. And again, if you're not going to be getting the full requested time, we can make sure that we provide you we provide you with the key aspects of your project. Sometimes your project have a big output or IO, so that you understand. So we would like to see that you can show us that you can deal with these, and how you can either analyze them, move them around, because for example, if you have a small output file or input file, it's easy to deal with them. You can use maybe SCP, but if you have a very large file system, you can't really just move terabytes of data from one machine to another machine. So we would like to see that you know how to deal with these things. We do have some options like Globus for the big file transfer, but again, make sure that to consult with the ALCF facilities to understand what is available and how we can help you ahead of time, and then explain that in your research proposal, so it makes it clear to us that you know how to deal with these information. Next slide, please. So that is something that I think Katherine mentioned earlier on, that we would like to see how your code performed in our machines. Usually the best way is to actually show it in the same hardware that you're going to be using. So Aurora is now, for example, at ALCF, Aurora is available and is a production machine right now, so anyone can get a DD allocation on it. So if you are targeting Aurora, for example, make sure to just do a small DD allocation, show your work on it, and it can be in a smaller scale, but this will tell us that you have set up your code, you have set up your system, you know how to use our scheduling and queues and so on. So it's really important to us. But sometimes you may not be able to do so, but if you can run on similar machine, let's say if you're targeting any NVIDIA GPUs, you can run on a similar NVIDIA GPU machine, and sort of using the maybe weaker scaling or a stronger scaling to show that if this is a smaller scale of the system, I have done it. And now if I want to kind of reach toward the larger size system, this is how am I going to do. That will still tell us that you've understand the system. It is really good to make sure to identify the number of nodes, MPI ranks, threads, and so on. So fine-tuning your submission scripts and to making sure you get the best of your applications. And if you are going to create lots of I/O, make sure you understand those, how to deal with them, and if there is any benchmark to our checkpoint or restart, make sure to emphasize on them and how you're gonna go from like one simulation to the next simulation. And again, if you have some scaling deficiencies, sometimes you're aware of them, and you can show these are the sort of the bottlenecks that I think the problem, and I have some ideas to test. Maybe you just didn't have a chance to do it, but mentioning those kind of ideas and like how you're going to test them and how you're going to go about them, it gives us the confidence that you understand your code and you understand the issues with it, and you have a way to go about it. Okay, so next slide, please. So you may have seen this weaker scaling and stronger scaling for traditional HPC applications. Basically, if you're increasing the problem size as the resources are increased, it's called weaker scaling. One thing I would like to mention that sometimes, at least in my experience, I have seen sometimes that there is like a weaker scaling of not necessarily a similar problem, but a similar application. And the PI says, okay, I've seen this weaker scaling on this application, and I think it's going to be the same on my problem. What I would like to see as a reviewer is to see the scaling results of your problem, maybe in a smaller size, on the system that you actually want to run on it. This will give me the confidence that you have tested your application, you're aware of all the issues that may have, or how to best tune it to do a best performance. So please make sure to do that. Now, if you are the AI and machine learning sort of project, then you can just show the scalings, for example, the convergence dependencies on factors like a hyperparameter, and discuss the scientific impact. So there are many different ways to show similar things, but it doesn't have to be this traditional weaker scaling or stronger scaling for AI and machine learning applications. Next slide, please. So we talked about ensembles and just a little bit more about it. So can I meet the computationally intensive creation while loosely coupling my jobs? So what are the things to consider that? If you require a large number of discrete or loosely coupled simulation where time to solution is an unattainable pacing issue, or if a software workflow solution for pre or post-processing a script that automates run management and analysis is provided to facilitate this volume of work, then this is probably a good idea to use ALCF resources. Now, if you can decouple them and run a lot of independent jobs on a smaller size system as you get the same answer with a reasonable time to solution, then that is not probably good use of LCF resources. So make sure that examine all the frequently asked questions for this particular one, which it could be a question for a lot of folks, question number 33 in the INCITE website. I think next slide, please. Yep. I think that is my segment, so I take it, return it back to Dyma, I believe.
Thanks, Yassi. Okay, so we continue discussing the details on the writing of INCITE proposal, and just few more words about data and AI applications. Again, obviously, that is the area which is growing, and we are welcoming AI-centered proposals to apply. So what could be an examples of the data-driven proposals or data-centered proposals? So obviously, again, ML, deep learning but as well as the data-intensive computing, or maybe experimental or observational data analytics, maybe complex or interactive workflows, streaming, real-time data analysis, graph analytics, statistics, obviously, or UQ. So these are examples, and if that is a proposal you would like to put forward, please do so. Obviously, there should be a clear, like, what is the strong aspect, strong HPC aspect in your data processing or AI proposal. So next slide. So let's then discuss a little bit what would be a successful data center proposal. So such a proposal should clearly articulate the objectives and the dependencies of the end-to-end research campaign. So e.g. training, data requirements, and generation, deep learning, data-driven model selection and validation, model embedding to augment simulation, etc. So you should also clearly list the application requirements, including databases, machine learning, deep learning frameworks, other software, containers, so on. And also, it's important, as we discussed already multiple times, it's always important to demonstrate that the software or your workflow is actually able to run on the resources which you are trying to request. So obviously, again, if your proposal is not only data, but a combination of the like, let's say, simulation or more traditional HPC plus data, those are obviously also welcome to apply. Next one. So data usage for all projects. And now we are switching gears, not only the data-driven, not only the AI proposals, but for all proposals. So you should list your total online and offline storage for the project. And for each milestone, list the total online and offline storage as well, including the estimate of duration of the data life cycle. For the large data project, include a discussion of the data requirements, like storage, duration, brief description of what is the type of the data you'll be storing. If you have like special, unusual requests, something more exotic, please be sure to describe in details those requests in your proposal. Make sure to read and familiarize yourself with the data policies, as Katherine already were mentioning about that. Next one. Okay, development work. So it is important, first of all, to mention that development projects are welcome. So don't think that you as a PI should always apply with the 100% ready, shiny proposal with all the tools ready. It is totally fine to apply and say like, hey, I have a component, or actually even like a larger component in your proposal, which needs further development or adjustment. So that is totally fine. There are obviously restrictions there. If you have a dependency, so if a certain milestone depend on that development work, yeah, you should clearly articulate that and put that in your in your milestone table. And obviously estimate additional computational resources which you will spend on the development part. All right. So the management plan is again like another integral component of the INCITE project application. So what are you going to put there? You are putting in your management plan the experience and credibility of your team members. So you are listing the scientific and technical members and their experiences as related to the proposed scientific and technical goals. Successful proposal teams demonstrate a clear understanding of the petascale or exascale computing and optimally use the resources to accomplish the proposed scientific goals. So important to mention that team members can be part of the different proposals. The PIs, no, but the team members, yes. So transparent use of time. What we mean by that is project involving multiple teams or different thrust areas should clearly state how the allocation will be distributed and managed. Again, this kind of falls back into the discussion umbrella and the community proposals. Community proposals are very welcome, but that's the place where you should give the details. You're giving the details about the community proposal in the management plan. So there's some tips there. you do include the personal justification, a brief description of the role of each team member. And although it's not required, the proposal with application developers are usually very favorably viewed by the reviewing panels. Okay, next one is a milestone table. Yet again, another integral part. Project without milestone tables, they will be dismissed. They will not be evaluated. So please do not forget to put your milestone table. So what are you going to put inside that milestone tables? You put your milestone appropriate for the size and duration of the requested award, and future modification in scope will be actually tracked through this table. So each milestone should have the computing resource and allocation requested in node hours, the production size runs, number of nodes, other requirements like file system, archival storage, duration of the storage, which software are you going to, which software are you going to employ? Then you are putting a brief summary of the computational tasks, then the dependencies on or between other milestones, and of course the timeline, start date, target completion date, and the status. All right, so that's the milestone table. Next one is the INCITE publications. Important to mention, so we are reporting back to DOE, and largely the success of the INCITE project is measured by the impact the INCITE is doing in science and in the scientific community, and that is usually judged by the publications. So please do not forget to include the publications from previous INCITE, and if you are getting the first time on the machines, please, when you publish the results of the work done on our machines, do not forget to include the appropriate acknowledgement. Yeah, I think that's it with the publications. And then we are getting closer to the end of this presentation. So let's kind of recap a little bit the timeline. So the call preparation is usually in the beginning of the year, and the call actually opens somewhere in the beginning of April. The deadline, as we mentioned already multiple times, this year is June 16th, but it's always around like mid-June. Right after the deadline, the submission deadline, we will have the technical assessment kicked off. That is usually taking time between like June and the beginning of August. The scientific review is coming usually in August, September timeframe. Then the both centers will gather for the decision meetings. Those are usually done late September, October, and the awards are usually announced in the beginning of November, around the supercomputing conference. From November, in December, PIs are being onboarded, so that everybody should be able to hit the ground in January 1st. All right, next one is okay, so here's the recap. Like, let's say you are a new PI, and at this point you are just asking yourself, am I ready to apply? So if you have your code ready, if you have your code ported to the architectures of the OLCF and ALCF machines, so most likely you are ready to apply. So important caveat here, or important thing to mention here, that quite often PIs using community codes. So it's much better to just check if the code has already been ported, which is quite often the case. So if it is ported, please apply for a DD and get your benchmark data on the machine you're trying to get access to. So that's, again, like we discussed it multiple times, that's the best way to prove that you are computationally ready, is to apply for the smaller DD allocation and get your workflows, get your software checked and benchmarked on the machine you're trying to get the time. So it is very important to make the benchmark examples that you're putting in your proposals are as similar to your production runs as possible. All right, so that is a question if you're ready to apply now. Next slide. Next slide is actually will give a little bit of details about the DD programs. So DD programs, they are director discretionary, so it's a smaller allocation, but it's a very easy to get It's a low bar, let's say foot in the door style. It's an online application. You just follow the links which are provided here in the bottom of this slide. You usually fill out an online form, pretty straightforward, explain a little bit what you're doing, what you're trying to do, how much time you need. The approval of those proposals are usually done very fast, like in a couple of weeks, you should be able to get the access and start doing some work on the machines. All right, so basically, looking into the timelines right now, if you are thinking about applying this year, that will be a good time to apply for DD, basically, this week. Okay, next slide is the final check. Okay, let's run the final check. So if you're applying for a proposal, those are the components you would need to have in your application. So executive summary, then the narrative, that's the bulk of the proposal, where you actually explain your science and explain the readiness of your proposals. Then personal justification and management plan, as we discussed. After that, milestone table, publications, and of course, biosketches, as with any other NSF or DOE proposals. Okay, with that final check, we are continue with questions and answers, and I will give back the mic to Katherine.
Thank you very much to both of you. And, you know, one thing I'd like to mention at this point is sort of a reminder, maybe because it's a little bit of a discontinuity, right? We do awarded note hours, right? And we awarded note hours in many respects because it is straightforward, right? It is easy to understand. And we've had many conversations about different ways we can award. But when we are looking in the award process, right, that the concept of like these other things, right, that a proposal needs, a proposal does not just need compute time, it needs data, right? It needs data movement perhaps too. You know, these things all play in, right? And this is one of the reasons that it's valuable to understand, you know, your larger workflow of what you're trying to do, because it gives us the right insight we have to be able to identify whether we can support your project within the larger portfolio. But are there, I know people have been pretty good about asking questions on chat, but I'll just give like a very brief like pause for a second in case anybody wants to put anything else in. And of course, there's no reason that there's no reason why you cannot continue to add questions to the chat as I go. We are really mostly done. These are just a few wrap-up points about like nearing the end of the process and of what you do when, you know, when you're done with your proposal, and some follow-ups that are sort of expected out of INCITE PIs. So just so you're aware, we use a tool called PureNet. You don't need to remember that, right? If you go to the DOE leadershipcomputing.org site and you click start a proposal, right, it will bring you there and you will register. Be aware you can save your proposal at any time, right? So you don't need to do it all at once. I encourage you to do that, actually, to save once or twice, right? Because it just, you know, save your file equivalent. It's equivalent to that. Save your file, right? The other thing I will point out is it's like most sites, right? Near closing time, it gets busy. So in that last couple days, be extra sure about saving your work. You will have to fill in all the required fields. They're you know, and they're mostly all straightforward. They're things like, you know, your PI and COI information and the, you know, numerical, you know, numbers, you know, the numerics for what compute time you need, etc. And then some specific question that do things like call out, like, are there data issues we need to be concerned about, etc. And then if you are starting your proposal, right, once you submit it, you can go back and edit. If it is before the proposal close time, you may go back and edit. So just because you've hit submit, you're okay to go back before I close and wrap up the full collection. It's just a valuable thing for people to understand. If they want to make sure something is submitted because they're like on travel and they're not sure, you can submit and go back if you have an opportunity. Next slide. As I already mentioned, I sort of touched on how we make the decision. So we take out of the science panel, not just the reviews for each proposal, but we also ask the panels to provide us with a ranked list. And really what that translates to is, you know, from 1 to N, the most important or impactful proposals they see in the panel. And there's a lot of that goes into that, as you can imagine. You know, there's a lot of different things that they're considering when they're considering what might be the most impactful. So we take that information, so the output of the conversations, the actual reviews themselves, that ranked list, along with the risk assessment from the technical component, the technical assessment, and fold that into making decisions about our larger portfolio for an individual year. As already mentioned, the process really, in the most fundamental sense, is owned by the division directors, right? So the directors for both ALCF and OLCF, it is driven heavily by the directors of science and the program manager, along with senior management from both facilities to get input and honestly load balance humans, right? Because we try to make sure there's enough support to make for all of the proposals. All right, next slide. As I mentioned, right, we are looking at a portfolio. So we do not have a requirement that physics gets this much and biology gets this much, right? There's no quota per domain. What we are trying to make sure of is that we have a balance across types of research and across across domains. And that's the best way to put that. It's that standard statement that, one domain could probably fill up the whole system, all the systems, but we try to look for some more breadth in that, just for all kinds of perhaps self-explanatory reasons. We do see oversubscription regularly. So for example, we might do a first draft of like the highest ranked proposals and look and see that we are still oversubscribed, right? That we have to consider how we actually can fit those projects. Our goal is not to cut your project. Historically, like 10 years ago, that sometimes there would be like shaves across all the projects just to make things fit. Our goal is to not do that. It is to provide what is requested, and that has been sort of validated by the science panel. By the science panel might provide us feedback that, okay, only milestone 1 and 2 are the ones we really want to see funded. So if we are cutting a proposal, it is probably due to feedback from the science panel, and that should be reflected in your review, the reviews that you see. But there are occasionally times where, for example, last year with a almost 7x oversubscription for Polaris, just to get any projects to fit, it was really dramatic. And I had to actually iterate with some PIs to make sure that they could work with the type of cut that we were having to do. That was tough. People were asking for very, very large asks on Polaris. And again, it just isn't that large of a resource. There is technically an appeals process. This is not an appeals process for the scientific review, right? So the merit review. It is a process error appeal. So what that means is if you feel like, something might have gone wrong in the processing of your proposal, or in how you viewed something, you can appeal and we can follow up. An example of this was, it was just something that got missed one year, right? A proposal was suggested to be 1 year, but also was suggested to do these specific milestones, which would take 2 years. We awarded 1 year and the PI went, wait, I can't, this is inconsistent, right? I can't quite fit that in there this way, right? Can we go back to doing can we make this a 2-year proposal? And we were able to make that change, right? That gives an example of, we're humans and we do this very manually behind the scenes. So that gives an example of the type of appeal that's feasible. Next slide. All right, we will make the announcements in early November. So if you're familiar with supercomputing, right, which is normally the week before the American Thanksgiving, we try to get everything out to PIs before that. The reality, though, is you won't really hear too much through the fall until those first couple weeks in November. At that point, though, when you hear if you are awarded, you will also have follow-ups from the facilities where you do have time, where they will start the process of onboarding you and also assigning you your catalyst or your liaison. This is a resource I really strongly encourage you to use if you have not used them before. These folks are fantastic, right? And can really do immense amounts to help your project get going and be successful in a larger sense over the course of your award. Next slide. And then this is like the last key thing, which is what would be required of you if you were an INCITE PI. So the first thing is regular status reports. This might evolve from not quarterly, but the point is that we require regular status reports of some form or shape. The reality is, if you're engaging with your catalyst or your liaison, that will also help us understanding where you are and why you're having issues, right? Or not having issues. If you're, really late to get started, things like this, we need to understand that, right? So we need to understand, for example, all kinds of aspects of where the projects are, and not only so we can answer to our bosses in DOE, but so that we can make sure that the system is ready. So for example, if everybody turns around and says, I have a huge run in August and all the projects are trying to do that, that's really hard, right? So we need that kind of conversation and engagement. And that can come through quarterly reports as well as engagement with the staff. As mentioned, right, the way we pay for these systems, basically, that, our currency, not like, the way we pay back to DOE for deploying the leadership computing facilities is in science, right, is demonstrating that we have got publications coming out of these, so that can be included in quarterly status updates, but it's also in things like science highlights. And if you've been around DOE or even within NSF, right, a lot of your program sponsors, you've experienced something probably like this before. But there's different types that we write, and we ask as a PI that you are willing to engage in writing these as you have successes with your work. And they range, right? Sometimes these are technical, right? Like you did something really cool, or in collaboration with someone, you did something really cool with the performance of what you're doing. But of course, most importantly, we're looking for those science accomplishments and progress on the milestones for what you proposed. You will need to submit an annual renewal request. So if you are a multi-year proposal, you do have to submit a renewal. It is a requirement. So your project will be ended if you do not submit a renewal. There are annual surveys that are required by our program sponsors that the ALCF and the OLCF sends out. They are intended to not be painful, but they are required. We have to send these out to our user base, and we ask please to get, just give 10 minutes, right, to answer these for us. In addition, we also ask, right, that we ask everyone to be good citizens. These are shared resources, and some people are more accustomed to being on a shared resource than others, but there are policies in place, and really most of this time, those policies are to help everybody be able to use the system well and to be able to share. So we ask that, if you've got team members who are really inexperienced, maybe connect them to our training programs, right? So they understand, we've got folks sometimes who come in and they haven't quite realized, the login node versus the compute node difference, right? And that can actually be very disruptive for a few days. But engage in the community to the degree you can if you are awarded this time, and have your team do the same, so that they understand the community that they're participating in and how to use these systems well and also nicely. Next slide. And so there was a big bold box, right? At the bottom, which is let us know your successes. And I actually kind of blew over that because I was talking about the highlights, but we do want to hear those. And sometimes there are successes that weren't even planned, or, highlights, hey, look, my program sponsor from, this other agency was really excited about this work. And they put out a press release. Let us know these things. These are fantastic. And they're not only exciting for us, they really are exciting for our program managers in DOE. Genuinely, they get very excited to see the outcome of INCITE proposals. As I mentioned, right, we have all of these opportunities for training and for learning at both facilities. Encourage your team to engage in those. They are free. Many of them are remote, right? So they don't even necessarily have to, to travel. But there's a lot of information there, and it also allows kind of very exciting opportunities to connect with all the experts at the facilities. As I mentioned, a lot of these staff at the facilities are our scientists, trained PhDs, right, who are doing this. They have a lot to offer in terms of approaches you might use. And then I'll also say that when you are publishing from work that used the INCITE resources, to please include an acknowledgement, right? We really need this. This goes back to us paying back to DOE for why we do this. These acknowledgements are very, very crucial to being able to understand the breadth of work that comes out of INCITE. Next slide. And this is connected to all of that, right? It is a really small world. If you are excited by INCITE, if you are excited about the work that you're getting out, right? If you're really happy with the experience you've had with INCITE or the amount you've been able to get done because of it, let your funding agency know, because it is a small world, right? This is this scenario of, the more people who are aware of the successes that come out of these programs, the better, and the more likely they are to continue to be supported. So please, let your sponsors know too, and contact us, beyond all of that, if you have questions, right? We really, whether this is from, you as a PI, or you now, please reach out, and we are happy to answer. Next slide. This is really the end. And I see a question, which I will poorly answer in just a second, but these are just quick reference for everyone, ways to quickly get in touch with both Oak Ridge Argonne and INCITE. I can tell you, right, if you do reach out to me, INCITE at DOE or Riley at DOE, etc., I can connect you to all of these as well, right? So it's any of these will probably get you to the right place eventually. But this is where you can go to really get started or dive into a more specific question. There's oh, right, great. There's a great question, and I'm going to get back to okay, I will answer these two questions I see here in order. I apologize that I don't know the explicit list for the EBSCOR states. I am aware of them, right? I just don't filter based on that. I will admit, right, we don't have easy, there's a story there, but I can actually probably look pretty quickly and answer that question. I will say that when I look from year to year, this is not the same question. This is not the same answer. If I look at sort of underrepresented, my brain just hiccuped on the acronym. But like universities for, underrepresented universities, I'm failing on the acronym. Please, everyone, forgive me. It's small, and it might be 20%, 15% from year to year for the individual institutions. And right, I am familiar with the EBSCOR states. I just don't, and I know where to get them. I just don't do the breakdown for it. But yes, so anyway, I can get back to you if you're curious, but I don't have an immediate answer. And there was another question, which is a great one, right? Which is just to touch back on what the difference is between ALCC and INCITE. So there's two big high-level differences. INCITE awards 60% of the time at Oak Ridge and Argonne. So that's the big one, right? It has 60% versus 30% for ALCC. ALCC is managed by our program sponsors in the Department of Energy. So it's where, in the Department of Energy, the Office of Science, and then Oscar and the Oscar facilities, they manage the ALCC program versus the ALCF and the OLCF was jointly managed INCITE. And the reason that is relevant is because ALCC has a more mission-driven component to it. So it is more driven to serving DOE priorities and DOE mission. So that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be DOE funded, but it has to be related to DOE priorities at that point. And you have to write a letter of intent, basically, to make sure that you are able to submit an ALCC proposal. Those are due, like there's a 6-month difference. So the ALCC call opens, it kind of opens right at the end of the calendar year, where they ask for the letters of intent, which translate to that, invitation to write a full proposal in the early part of a calendar year. So ALCC has some other subtle differences, right? Which is that sometimes the scale is a little different, and the review process is slightly different as well, but it is fundamentally, very similar in that respect. But it is really this mission-driven versus open science-driven component for INCITE. INCITE's really the flagship for the leadership computing facilities and for that national user facility mission. Right. Any other questions? So what happens if there's a time gap in these awards? Can you clarify this for me? So, like, meaning,
Hi,
yes,
this
that's a
is,
short version. Can you-
Margaret Chung.
Hi.
Hi. So I have a ALCC award and it will end in a few weeks. But on the other hand, because it's a year award and there's a lot of data analysis going on, and there's a lot of like also planned computing that won't go beyond like, the expiration date. But I have missed the deadline for the renewal or the letter of intent that's supposed to be last year. So I wonder what happened. Now I'm like in a no
Yep.
person zone.
Absolutely.
shall
And
I
you're
do?
not alone, right? You're not the first person who's run into this for various reasons. My answer is a sincere one, although it might sound pat. Our goal really is for you to get your work done. So truly what we tend to do is help bridge that with discretionary. So you're not going to get shut down. Make sure to, just make sure to engage with us, right? So we do this and we set this
Who
up.
should I engage with? Who should I?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me at ALCF, right? And we can make sure that there is that we have a path for you, right?
Okay.
And I'm Riley at ANL.gov, but I'm also Riley at DOE Leadership Computing. I can put Riley in front of all of these things, except for Oak Ridge. I'm not at Oak Ridge.
Should I also reach out to my DOE program managers about this, requesting some kind of gap?
So you absolutely can, right? But they won't be able to help you explicitly. So what I mean is they won't be able to like assist in getting you the gap time at the ALCF or the OLCF. I mean, I know you're partly at the ALCF at least. I just can't remember if you're also at the OLCF.
Yeah, I have an allocation on both through ALCC. Yeah,
But
I'll reach out to you for go contact with offline, but thank you so much.
No
I
problem.
was a little bit worried that I will be left high and dry right
really,
after.
there's multiple models, and I think this is a general piece of information which is valuable for everybody, right? Whether it's that you're finishing an award but you're not quite done, or you have analysis that still needs doing, or you do have a gap. Really, like, we want you to finish the science, right? The premise of, oh no, you're done, lose that, you're done now, be gone. That is not how we function. I would say another way to view this is we think of this as an investment, right? We're trying to invest in you getting your work done. So
Thank
please,
you so
yeah,
much.
we're not.
I'll reach out offline. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, there's a great question, and I will generalize this, which is the rules about foreign nationals getting access to the systems, and the short version is that to get accounts, there's a process to get accounts at both facilities, and if you are foreign national, there is additional paperwork, and I'm sorry, there is. So when you start that account process, it will trigger, it will trigger all of the different paperwork you need to fill out. And you'll also get a time frame. And it's different. It's different at Oak Ridge versus Argonne, the time frame for a foreign national. And it also can be different depending on where that foreign national is from. So I am sorry, but that's true. But once you start that account process, like, you know, there's, if you go to ALCF, you know, the ALCF webpage or the Oak Ridge webpage, you know, you'll see the get started, right? You know, and submit a DD and start, you know, request an account. That will trigger all of those things. You don't necessarily have to worry specifically about the 593. What was mentioned is that 593 just happens to be the name of the ANL form. That is one step in a foreign national getting the account. So, but keep that in mind, right? So that does, as I had mentioned, right, that does mean it's not as fast getting on. And the individual centers and the user support folks you're engaging with will be able to tell you, right, okay, based on your country of origin, this is about the time frame to be able to get access. Any other questions? Oh, I appreciate everybody showing up this morning. I hope this was helpful. The reality is, you know, I think everybody has very specific circumstances and questions, and I've, you know, I've thought this before, that, you know, just even sometimes just literally just sit down and people can ask their questions with like only like 2 minutes of chatting. But sometimes this context can really give people a better sense of kind of what they're in for, what they're bringing upon themselves, right? You know, in making the INCITE proposal process start. But we are here. Our goal is to answer anything you guys might have, of any questions you might have. So please reach out. And as mentioned, this will be available, right? So these slides will be posted. If you've looked at them already from previous years, you'll see how similar they are, but it'll also have those specific details about, for example, looking into 2026. Thank you, everybody.